Every altar space for tarot readings require a place to put your tarot decks. And having come to this realization, I came up with the idea to create a petite stand or plinth to rest them on top of. I came up with a number of designs with the practicality to be slightly raised from the table to allow you to conveniently wrap your fingers around the deck when lifting them up. Like most of my projects, I start off with some veg tan leather. This is 2.5 mil thick, so it allows me to have some level of rigidity, but still able to like form it around things. So a very nice like thickness for me to work with. Now, as you can see in the video, I am using pieces of cardboard templates to cut out and measure my leather into workable pieces. So at this point, I throw these manageable pieces into the laser cutter, having planned out my design in Adobe Illustrator. Now, the laser cutter is super useful for prototyping. It's not a tool that I particularly like to use regularly. I prefer to have dies made and have them stamped out that way. But at the early stage, this is a really convenient way of coming up with ideas. So as you can see here, I am using a bottle of water to wet the leather. This is called casing. And that allows me to use stamps such as my Midlands Apothecary and Leather Crafting logo, and the little subline underneath saying handmade in England, and allow the leather to allow impressions to be made when I apply force. So in this particular instance, I'm using a 4-ton clicker press, which is a device with a big lever on the top. And as I pull it down, it applies up to 4 tons of pressure onto the piece. So here I'm spinning this piece round and doing it twice. The reason why I'm doing that is because the clicker press that I have isn't quite level. So in order to ensure that I've got an even deboss, I just spin it around 180 degrees and it allows me to ensure that looks very nice and clean. These cardboard templates have also been cut out on the laser cutter, and it just allows me to line everything up. Back in the old days, I would use a ruler and I would keep measuring all around the edges to ensure it was in the center. Obviously, that wasn't a very efficient way of using my time, but this method seems to work a treat. So one of the designs involves doing some tooling. And by tooling, I just mean using these stamps that I hit with a mallet, and it allows me to create more impressions in the leather. So for this design, actually, no, there are several designs. I've got different sizes of stars, and I'll just go around just to fill in some of that empty space, just to allow the leather to kind of like pop a little bit more once it's dyed and finished. This piece in particular is called the 3 Moons, by the 3 Moons. And I have a 5 moon version, and I have a no moon version, which is just the plain leather purely with tooling over the top of it. Now, it's important to say that at this stage, the leather is still somewhat damp. When we cased it earlier, we allowed 15 minutes for the water to soak in, and that gives me about half an hour to 45 minutes of working time before I have to like dampen it again. But I can get all of this done within a few minutes. So the casing process for this particular piece only has to be done once. So in this video, I'm actually making 2 designs. One is the 3 moon and the other one is just the stars. And the first one is being dyed in walnut, which is this one here, and the other one in royal blue. So what I'm doing here is called dip dyeing, and it's great for processing lots of leather at the same time. And it also ensures that there's an even coat throughout the leather. Now, it's really, really important that you allow the excess dye to run off. The rest of it will eventually evaporate, but you need to give it a fighting chance. Otherwise, sometimes where the dye will pool on the top, you end up with like spots. And that's something that I try and avoid doing. Sometimes it's inevitable because the cut of leather that you get has blemishes, and it kind of like absorbs more or less dye in those areas than it would everywhere else. But if I can help it, then I'll try not to allow that to happen. And here you can see me struggling with a smaller tub of royal blue dye, and I'm just having to work the leather around in that Tupperware box just to ensure that there's full coverage on the leather. Personally, I'm a huge fan of doing airbrushing on leather because it allows me to be very creative with where I'm spraying. However, the caveat to that is that in an enclosed environment, the particles of leather end up floating around the air, and then you tend to find that there's like perhaps a good meter's worth of blue or brown starting to soak into the surfaces, depending on what you're spraying. So, like I said, for the batch processing, I'll stick with this. If I have to do any fine details, then I'll use the airbrush, but very minimally, normally by a door or a window, somewhere where there's plenty of ventilation. Once I'm all done, I'll give that about 24 hours to dry, and then I'll move on to oiling. So for oiling, I use neat's foot oil, and what that does, it just allows me to get the leather a bit softer again, because after casing it and dip dyeing it, the leather becomes quite stiff. So this just allows the leather to soften a little bit, whilst also allowing the pigmentation in the leather to be absorbed further, even out the dye color. And then I'll move on to the buffing wheel, and I will buff off the oil. And that's after I've let the oil sit there for several hours. And what will tend to happen is the leather will look quite pale and chalky from the surface. And after buffing it, it takes it from a very dull finish to quite a shiny finish. So here I am using the airbrush to spray Resolene onto the pieces. Resolene is an acrylic-based protector for leather. It just gives it that protection of, like, if you were to spill anything on it, the water, for example, would pool on the surface rather than be absorbed into it, because leather naturally likes to absorb things, and there's the fact it gets stained easy by things like dye. But this just adds that protection to it. Also, once it's dried and you buff it again by hand or by machine, it gets even shinier. Now here I am processing the suede for these pieces. The 2 out of the 3 pieces, the ones with the cutouts in, have a piece of suede sandwiched between the leather. I have 4 or 5 different colors that I keep in stock. And for this one, obviously I'm using the blue, but I also have wine, mulberry, and another one that eludes me right now. So here I am just using another cardboard template to trim that piece of suede. It's pigskin suede, this is. And once I've got this all cut out, I will use a roller to get rid of some of the dust particles that end up accumulating on some of these pieces. So this is one of the pieces that uses hardware. I think this is the very first range of products that I've used, that I create, that uses hardware. So I'm screwing in these studs, and these will act as feet for the deck holder, and that will just keep it propped up off the table by about 1 centimeter, allowing you to wrap your fingers around the deck. And as you can see, I've got those kind of cutouts in the middle, which is where the deck will overlap because it's narrower than the cards. It just allows people to, like, pick up the cards much easier than if it were directly on a table. And I'm kind of like loose-fittingly putting these studs on right now. I will be going back later and using Loctite to secure the screws, because we don't want these falling off. So now I'm using a water-based contact cement to start gluing the pieces together. The trick here is to apply just enough glue for 100% coverage, but don't oversaturate the leather. We want the adhesive to get very tacky very quickly. And if you end up with like pools of glue, it will hinder the adhesion process by A, slowing it down, and B, creating pockets within the leather, which are particularly apparent when you come to glue the edges. because sometimes if you don't, if you use too much glue, you end up with like these separation in the leather on the edges. That when you come to finish it, you kind of see a thick seam line running down the edge, and that's something to definitely avoid. And here I'm using an awl to line up the stitch holes with the top and bottom pieces. It's a super fiddly process. What I'm actually doing right now is I'm on my knees, and this allows me to be eye level with the leather so that I can properly see the alignment. I'm not 100% sure that this is what I would do if the camera weren't running, but recording this process whilst doing the leather work, I have to really do my best to ensure that everything stays in shot and in focus whilst allowing me to actually do what I need to do. And I use this rubber mallet to help bring down the edges. Normally what I'd do is I'd throw a piece of leather under the clicker press to secure it down even further using all that pressure. But unfortunately, because of the feet, I'm unable to do that. So I have to do everything by hand here. And here I'm using some pliers with thin cuts of leather around the edge just to protect the leather. And I'm using a bunch of pressure just to ensure those edges are pressed down. It's not really a thing that I like to do because it really hurts my hands because of the amount of pressure that I'm putting down into the pliers, but it needs to be done. And these are the edges that I'm doing again, just like the main parts, and those will be sewn eventually onto either end to stop the cards from slipping around. Now, having swapped over the buffing wheel for the sanding drum, I am going to clean up the edges, or at least most of them. As you can see here, the drum won't get in the recesses, but I can do the rest. The remainder I have to do by hand using cuts of sandpaper. So as much as I would love to be able to get the machine in here to sand the insides, I'm using a combination of sanding sticks just to clean up that edge. Now, for one of the most satisfying steps of leatherworking, it's doing the bevel edging. So after sanding the edges, what you'll tend to see is that the corners will flare out, creating quite an unsightly look to the edges and also not a very nice feel. So this tool, as you run it all the way around the edges, it gets rid of that bit of excess whilst also creating a very smooth and very small bevel on the edge as well. Now the next step here is to get the dyeing pen out, just to give the edges an undercoat now. So the pen that I'm using, you can buy empty and fill it up with what you want. In my case, I filled it up with leather dye, and it does a fantastic job of allowing me to quickly dye edges with a lot of precision, to be fair. It helps having the right angles on the nib just to get it in some of those awkward places. And then, like I said, I'll just run this all the way around the edge before doing the edge painting. Now, the reason for this is because it's, quite honestly, kind of helps hide any mistakes. Just even the smallest miss on the acrylic paint, you can see the pale undyed color underneath. And although that doesn't happen really very often at all, it's just a precaution, really. And honestly, the step takes like 1 or 2 minutes, and I'd rather just like do that and save any headaches later on. I have this tool for painting edges, and it's a really cool drum, but unfortunately I have to use the pen version of this, which is kind of frustrating to use because you have to keep dipping it into the paint every few seconds to recover it, and it takes much longer. But unfortunately, because of the recess that I have here, it forces me to use the pen just to get in those awkward positions. But honestly, once I'm done, you wouldn't be able to tell which device I used. You get exactly the same results. It's just the way of applying the paint. Here we go, as promised. I came back with the Loctite afterwards. Once everything had dried, just unscrewed those studs, popped a little bit on. I don't want to like lather it because Perhaps one day someone might want to take these off and replace them, but just enough for it to be held in place and not ever fall off. So this job only takes a couple of minutes just to get it all done, but it just gives me as a maker the peace of mind to ensure that people who receive these pieces don't end up with like a piece rattling around in the box. I would hate for that to happen. So the hand sewing here is me sewing those two end pieces onto the top of the piece that stop the cards from shifting around on the base. Off the top of my head, the process takes about 20 to 30 minutes. What I'm doing here is a saddle stitch, taking it all the way around the edge. And the reason why I'm doing a saddle stitch as opposed to using my sewing machine is because I get to use a much thicker thread. And on pieces like this that are quite decorative, it's way more satisfying to have a thick hand sewn thread than a thin machined thread. Although there is a place for both of them. That's my reasoning for why I've done that. And then I'm just melting the ends here with a heat pen. And then I'm tapping all of the thread down with the rubber hammer again, just to bring that in line with the leather. And it also stops the thread from like snagging on things. And then finally, using a recyclable EVA foam, which I've also cut out on the laser cutter, I pack the two pieces that I've been making. So we have the walnut one, and here we have the royal blue. And that's how I make the tarot deck holders.